Welcome, listeners, and thank you for tuning into Anana's creation. Tonight, we begin a journey into the life of a man who danced on the edge of chaos, a phantom who treated life as his personal chessboard. This is the unbelievable story of Leo Vance, a master of mischief in a world that had forgotten the meaning of magic. Our story begins not in some mythical realm of gods and monsters, but in the glittering heart of New York City, within the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the annual Starlight Gala, an event where the city's elite gathered to outbid each other on priceless artifacts, all in the name of charity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. To the untrained eye, it was a pinnacle of culture and philanthropy. To Leo Vance, it was a hunting ground. He stood near a marble column, a ghost in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He wasn't the tallest man in the room, nor the most classically handsome. His power was more subtle. It was in the way he observed, his gray eyes missing nothing, cataloging the subtle tells of everyone present. The nervous twitch of a CEO facing an audit, the forced smile of a socialite trapped in a loveless marriage, the hungry gaze of a rising politician. Leo saw the strings that held their world together, and his greatest pleasure was to gently, or sometimes violently, pluck them. His target for the evening wasn't a person, but an object. The heart of the Nile, a fist-sized sapphire on a platinum chain, said to have been a gift from a pharaoh to his queen. It was the evening's main attraction, expected to fetch over $50 million. Its owner and the host of the gala was Marcus Thorne, a man who built his empire on corporate raids and broken promises. Thorne was a titan of industry, a man who believed he was untouchable, that his money built a fortress around him that no one could breach. Leo disagreed. Fortresses, he knew, were just puzzles waiting to be solved. He nursed a glass of champagne, the bubbles dying a slow death. He wasn't interested in stealing the sapphire for its value. Money was a tool, a boring and predictable one. No, his prize was much more important. Hidden within the platinum clasp of the necklace was a microdrive containing the unencrypted financial records of Thorne's entire illegal operation. Thorne was so arrogant, so confident in his security, that he kept his darkest secrets hidden in plain sight, draped around the neck of a model for the world to admire. The plan had been in motion for weeks. It involved a disgruntled geologist, a 3D printing artist in Brooklyn, and a security guard with a gambling problem. The replica, currently safe in the inner pocket of his jacket, was flawless. It was grown from a synthetic crystal, cut by lasers guided by scans of the original, and weighed exactly the same, down to the microgram. The real challenge wasn't the object, it was the swap. He saw his opening. Marcus Thorne was holding court, his booming laugh echoing through the hall as he glad-handed a senator. The model wearing the necklace was momentarily alone, checking her reflection in the glass case of a Roman statue. Her name was Amelia, and Leo knew she had a weakness for card tricks. He approached with a disarming smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "I just had to say, that piece is breathtaking. It's almost magical." Amelia, bored from hours of standing still, brightened. "Isn't it? It feels like wearing a piece of the sky." "Magic is my trade, you know," Leo said, pulling a deck of cards from his pocket. "May I show you something?" She giggled, intrigued. The small crowd around them had their eyes on Thorne. No one was watching the pretty model and the charming stranger. This was Leo's stage. He fanned the deck. "Pick a card, any card. Don't show it to me." She drew one, the King of Spades. "Now," Leo continued, his fingers moving in a blur, shuffling, cutting, and weaving the cards with mesmerizing skill. "The world is full of misdirection. We look at the grand gesture, the big explosion, and we miss the sleight of hand that's happening right in front of us." His eyes met hers, and for a second, she felt a strange, hypnotic pull. His movements were fluid, his patter distracting. He made her place the card back into the deck. Then he shuffled again. He tapped the top of the deck. "Is this your card?" He revealed the Queen of Hearts. She shook her head, smiling. "No." "Of course not," Leo said with a theatrical sigh. "That would be too easy. True magic requires a little finesse. Sometimes, what you're looking for has been right where you least expect it." During the shuffle, in a move that lasted less than a heartbeat, his left hand had dropped the deck. As he bent to pick it up, his right hand, concealed by his body, had moved towards her neck. His fingers, light as a feather, found the clasp of the necklace. He'd studied the mechanism for days. It was a simple magnetic lock, designed for ease. A soft click, inaudible in the din of the gala. The real necklace was in his palm. His other hand, coming up from the floor, already held the replica. As he straightened up, he presented the cards to her again, fanned out. Perhaps it's here? Her eyes followed the cards. And in that moment of distraction, his right hand moved back to her neck, the replica now cool against her skin. Click. The swap was complete. The entire sequence had taken 4 seconds. "No," she said, still looking at the cards. Leo smiled. "Then I must be losing my touch." He made the deck of cards vanish into thin air, a simple trick of a collapsing sleeve mechanism. "But I have a feeling your card will turn up." He reached behind her ear and produced the King of Spades. Amelia gasped with delight. "How did you do that?" "A magician never reveals his secrets," Leo said with a wink. "It was a pleasure to meet you." He gave a slight bow and melted back into the crowd, the weight of the real, heart of the Nile, a satisfying pressure in his pocket. An hour later, the auction began. The sapphire, under the bright lights of the stage, looked magnificent. The bidding was furious. A tech billionaire, an oil sheik, and a Russian oligarch went to war. The final price was $62 million. A new record. Marcus Thorne took the stage, his face beaming with pride and avarice. He spoke of generosity, of giving back, of the power of art to inspire. From the back of the room, Leo Vance watched the man sell a worthless piece of glass for a fortune. He felt a cold smile touch his lips. Thorne thought he had won. He was swimming in applause and cash. But Leo had the real prize. He slipped out of the gala, the city lights of New York a welcoming embrace. He hailed a cab and, in the quiet solitude of the back seat, he carefully worked the clasp of the necklace. The microdrive popped out, no bigger than a grain of rice. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. This tiny object was the key. It wouldn't just expose Marcus Thorne. It would bring his entire corrupt empire crashing down in a symphony of chaos. The world saw Leo Vance as a trickster, a charming con man. But he was something more. He was a balancing act. A necessary agent of mischief in a world that had become too rigid, too predictable, too unjust. And this, he thought, as the cab sped through the sleeping streets, was only the beginning. Leo Vance didn't live in a penthouse overlooking the city. Such places were cages, however gilded. He preferred the organized anonymity of a converted warehouse loft in a part of Brooklyn that the gentrification wave had not yet fully consumed. The space was a paradox, minimalist and open, yet filled with complex machinery that hummed with latent power. To any visitor, it might look like the workshop of a modern artist. In reality, it was the den of a master illusionist. He placed the heart of the Nile on a sterile white workbench. The sapphire glittered under the cold LED lights, a beautiful lie that had fooled a room full of millionaires. With the precision of a surgeon, he removed the microdrive from its hidden clasp. It was a speck of black silicon, a digital soul holding the sins of Marcus Thorne. Sliding it into a custom-built reader connected to a holographic interface, Leo began his work. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Thorne was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. His digital fortress would be as formidable as his physical one. As the system booted up, a wall of code materialized in the air before Leo. It was beautiful in its complexity, a fractal pattern of encryption that shifted and writhed like a living thing. It was a digital serpent, and it was daring him to try and charm it. Most hackers would have launched a brute force attack, throwing billions of password combinations at the wall until it broke. That was loud, clumsy, and artless. Leo's approach was different. He didn't break locks, he listened to them. He watched the encryption's defense patterns, the way the algorithms responded to his soft, probing queries. He was looking for a rhythm, a cadence, a tiny imperfection in the code's heartbeat. Hours bled into one another. The city outside fell silent, then slowly began to stir again with the dawn. Leo didn't notice. He was in a trance, a silent dialogue with the machine. He found what he was looking for around 4 in the morning. A recursive loop, a tiny piece of code that, under specific pressure, referenced itself in a way that created a momentary vulnerability. It was the digital equivalent of a nervous twitch, a signature. The programmer who designed this was brilliant, but also proud. He had signed his work. Leo smiled. Got you. He crafted a counter-algorithm, a key designed not to break the lock, but to persuade it to open on its own. He fed it into the system. For a tense minute, the holographic serpent thrashed wildly, its defenses flaring. Then it went still. The code unwound, the patterns dissolved, and neat columns of folders and files appeared in their place. He was in. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, in the climate-controlled vault of Thorn Tower, a different kind of examination was underway. Jessica Albright, Marcus Thorne's head of security, was not a woman who believed in luck or trusted in charm. She trusted data and process. Before the Heart of the Nile was to be transferred to its new owner, it had to undergo a final verification. She placed the necklace under a multispectral scanner. Visually, it was perfect. The weight was correct. The cut was an exact match. But Jessica had been a gemologist before she worked in corporate security. She knew that every true stone has a history, a story told in light. She activated the deep ultraviolet spectrum. A real sapphire of that origin would fluoresce a faint, milky orange. The stone on her scanner bed glowed a sharp, clinical blue, the color of a synthetic. Her blood ran cold. She ran the scan again, and a third time. The result was the same. It was a fake, a flawless, multi-million-dollar fake, but a fake nonetheless. She walked, not ran, to the penthouse elevator. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she entered Thorne's office, he was on a call, shouting at a competitor. He muted the call, his face a mask of irritation. "What is it, Jessica?" "I'm in the middle of disemboweling a rival." "The Heart of the Nile, sir," she said, her voice perfectly level. "It's a replica." The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. Thorne's face slowly drained of color, replaced by a rising tide of crimson fury. He ended his call without a word. "What did you just say?" he whispered, the sound more menacing than any shout. "It's a synthetic crystal, sir. An exceptionally good one, but it's not the original. It was swapped at the gala." Thorne stared at her, then threw the crystal paperweight on his desk against a bulletproof window. It bounced off with a dull thud. "Who?" he roared. "Who had the nerve?" "That's what I'm here to find out," Jessica replied, unfazed. "But sir, there's a bigger problem. The microdrive." Thorne's rage froze, replaced by a look of genuine fear. He had forgotten about his little secret compartment. He had believed it was the most secure place on Earth. Back in his Brooklyn loft, Leo sifted through the digital wreckage of Thorne's career. It was all there: illegal stock trades, blackmail material on politicians, records of environmental crimes that had been systematically covered up. It was enough to put Thorne away for several lifetimes. But Leo kept digging, drawn by an instinct that there was something more. And then he found it, a folder, buried 3 layers deep, protected by a secondary encryption that was even more sophisticated than the first. It was labeled with a single, ominous title: Project Chimera. It took him another hour to crack it. What he found inside made the financial crimes look like child's play. It wasn't about money. It was lists of names, genetic sequences, and reports on unsanctioned human trials. It was a level of depravity Leo hadn't been prepared for. This wasn't just corruption, it was monstrous. In Thorn Tower, Jessica was already in the security center, her eyes scanning hours of high-definition footage from the gala. She fast-forwarded through the speeches, the empty chatter, the fake smiles. She was looking for an anomaly, a moment that didn't fit. And then she saw it. Amelia, the model, momentarily alone. A man in a tuxedo approaching her. A deck of cards. A charming smile. He was a ghost, someone who didn't belong to any of the known circles of the elite. She zoomed in on his face. The cameras caught him in perfect clarity for a fraction of a second. She ran the image through every database she had access to: federal, state, international. There were no matches. No credit cards, no driver's license, no social security number. The man, for all intents and purposes, did not exist. But Jessica saw the way he moved. The economy of motion. The way his eyes never stopped scanning. He was no ordinary party crasher. She watched the footage again, slowing it down frame by frame. She saw the sleight of hand, the moment he bent down, the infinitesimal pause as his hand neared the necklace. "There you are," she whispered to the screen. The hunt had begun. Marcus Thorne wanted his data back, but Jessica Albright wanted something more. She wanted the ghost who had walked into their world and vanished, leaving a masterpiece of deception in his wake. She wanted Leo Vance. The first light of morning cut through the large industrial windows of Leo's loft, but it brought no warmth. He sat before the holographic files of Project Chimera, the playful satisfaction of his heist completely gone, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. This was not the clean, predictable corruption of Wall Street. This was something twisted and dark, something that went beyond greed. The files detailed experiments that aimed to rewrite human biology, trials conducted on vulnerable people who had been erased from society. It was the work of a man playing God, with no regard for the lives he shattered. For the first time in a long while, Leo Vance felt out of his depth. His games of mischief were meant to disrupt the arrogant, to humble the powerful. But this was a monster he hadn't known existed. Leaking the files anonymously was no longer an option. The data was too complex, too horrifying. Released without context, it would be dismissed as a hoax, a conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet. No, he had to understand the full scope of this before he acted. He had to find the truth behind the project. He dug deeper into the files, searching for a name, a location, anything that could serve as a foothold. And he found one, not in the experimental data, but in a series of encrypted internal memos from over a decade ago. It was a name that appeared again and again in heated arguments with Marcus Thorne himself, Dr. Eris Thorne. Marcus's younger, more brilliant, and long-vanished brother. The official story was that Eris, a genius in the field of genetic engineering, had suffered a mental breakdown and disappeared, living as a recluse somewhere off the grid. The memos, however, told a different story. They were filled with Eris's passionate objections to the direction of the research, citing ethical lines that Marcus was gleefully crossing. The last memo was a single, chilling sentence from Marcus to his head of research. "My brother's sentimentality has become a liability. Contain it." Shortly after, Eris Thorne vanished from public life. Leo finally had a thread. Eris Thorne wasn't just a victim. He was the key. If he was still alive, he knew the truth of Project Chimera from its very beginning. Finding him was now Leo's primary objective. Across the city, Jessica Albright gathered her small, elite security team. They were the best Marcus Thorne's money could buy, veterans of corporate espionage and digital warfare. "Forget the usual methods," she told them, her voice crisp and clear. "Our target does not exist in any traditional sense. He has no digital footprint. We are not looking for a man. We are looking for his methods, his art." She projected 2 images onto the main screen. One was a close-up of the playing cards he'd used in his magic trick. The other was a detailed spectroscopic analysis of the fake sapphire. "The cards are a dead end for now," she said. "A niche brand, but still too common to be a reliable tracker. The sapphire, however, a synthetic stone of this quality is not made. It is grown. The process is precise, and every lab has a unique signature, like a fingerprint, in the crystal's lattice and isotopic makeup. I want every resource focused on this. Find me the lab that made this stone." She knew it was a long shot, but it was a precise, scientific approach. It was the kind of puzzle she excelled at solving. While her team began their work, she started her own line of inquiry, mapping every high-end security camera in a 10-block radius of the museum, looking for a glimpse of her ghost before he arrived or after he left. She would find the cracks in his perfect illusion. Leo, meanwhile, began his hunt for a ghost of his own. He submerged himself in the deep web, searching for any trace of Eris Thorne. He found nothing for hours. It was as if Eris had been digitally scoured from existence. But Leo knew that nothing is ever truly erased. It's just displaced. He shifted his search, looking not for Eris, but for his work, old academic papers, research citations, forum posts from former students. He found a faint echo in a forgotten corner of the internet, a post on an obscure biohacking forum from 6 years ago. Someone using the handle Deadless had solved a complex protein folding problem that had stumped the forum for months. The elegance of the solution, the unique coding style, it felt familiar to Leo. It mirrored the style of Eris's early academic work. It was a long shot, but it was the only echo he had. He began tracing the digital signature of Deadless. In Thorn Tower, Jessica received her first breakthrough. A specialist on her team had found a match for the sapphire's isotopic signature. "It's rare," the tech explained, pointing at the screen. The specific heavy water isotope used in the cooling process, it's almost exclusively used by one company, a boutique experimental lab. They specialize in creating custom crystals for advanced electronics and optics. They're very discreet, very expensive. The lab is located in Brooklyn. Jessica felt a jolt of adrenaline. "What's the name of the company?" "It's registered as Applied Quantum Solutions," the tech said. "But it's just a name. The ownership is buried under 3 layers of international shell corporations." "Then start digging," Jessica ordered. a cold smile touching her lips. "I want to know who owns that lab." Back in his loft, Leo was about to pack a bag. The trail of Daedalus was faint, but it was leading him towards the quiet, academic town of Ithaca in upstate New York. It was time to move, to get out of the city. He believed he had a head start. He believed he was still the one in control, the hunter pursuing his prey. As he reached for his jacket, a small, unobtrusive icon on one of his monitors suddenly flashed red. It was a silent tripwire he had placed deep within the city's financial networks. It wasn't an alarm for a physical breach, but a digital one. Someone was running a high-level, brute force inquiry into the ownership records of one of his shell corporations. Leo froze, his eyes locked on the screen. The name of the corporation being investigated was Applied Quantum Solutions. The hunter had just heard the snap of a trap behind him. They had found his workshop. They had found his fingerprint. He wasn't on the hunt anymore. He was the prey, and the predators were closing in far faster than he could ever have imagined. The red light on the monitor wasn't flashing. It was pulsing a steady, rhythmic beat like a digital heart signaling a fatal wound. For a full second, Leo Vance stood perfectly still, the silence of the loft amplifying the silent alarm. The shell corporation was his. The lab was his. They had found him. His carefully constructed world of anonymity had just been breached. Panic was a fire that burned away options. Leo had trained himself to feel the cold, clear logic of ice in moments like these. He didn't have hours. He likely didn't even have 30 minutes. He began to move with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, a dance of pure efficiency. His first stop was the workbench. He grabbed a small, metallic object, no larger than a deck of cards. It was a Faraday-caged, solid-state drive. With a few keystrokes on his terminal, he transferred the entirety of the Project Chimera files, the only copy in existence, to the hardened device. The transfer took 7 seconds. The moment it was complete, he initiated the clean slate protocol. It was a beautiful and brutal process. The holographic displays in the center of the room flared, overloading with terabytes of nonsensical junk data. Lines from Shakespeare, complex mathematical equations, the entire genetic code of a fruit fly. Then, a simulated electromagnetic pulse fried every circuit board, every processor, every storage device in the loft. The humming workshop fell completely silent. The digital ghost was exorcised. Next, misdirection. From a burner laptop that was never connected to his main system, he sent a single encrypted command. Miles away, a server in Iceland came to life, initiating a series of high-volume financial transfers from another of his shell accounts, this one based in the Cayman Islands. It was a digital flare designed to make Jessica's team think their target was a financial phantom liquidating assets. It would split their focus, even if only for a few crucial minutes. He slung a worn leather messenger bag over his shoulder. It was his go bag, always packed, containing cash, fake IDs for 3 different identities, a set of lockpicks, and a few other essential tools of his trade. He was ready to leave, but not yet. He walked back to the now-dead workbench and placed a single playing card on its surface, face up. The Joker. In a black, unmarked van 2 blocks away, Jessica Albright watched a live satellite image of the warehouse. "He knows we're coming," she said, her voice calm. Financial just flagged a massive asset transfer from a related account, routed through Reykjavik. "It's a smokescreen." The team leader, a grim-faced man named Carter, looked at her. "So he's running." "He's not running. He's repositioning," Jessica corrected. "He's a chess player, not a sprinter. He's already 3 moves ahead. We go in now. Quietly. I don't want a single gunshot unless he fires first. Our objective is the drive. Capturing him is a secondary, but highly desirable, outcome." Her team, clad in black tactical gear, moved out, converging on the building from 3 directions. They flowed like shadows through the pre-dawn gloom, disabling the external cameras and overriding the electronic locks with silent, practiced ease. Leo did not head for the door or the windows. That was the amateur's way out. He walked to the center of the loft and lifted a heavy Persian rug, revealing a section of the floor that looked identical to the rest of the polished concrete. He pressed his palm against it. A biometric scanner hidden beneath the surface read his print. With a soft hiss of hydraulics, the square panel lowered, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. It wasn't a secret elevator or a comfortable tunnel. It was the building's original, century-old pneumatic tube chase, a vertical network of pipes that once shuttled messages between floors. It was a dirty, cramped, and undignified escape route. It was perfect. He slid into the darkness, his feet finding the maintenance rungs bolted to the wall. Above him, he heard the faint scuff of boots on the roof. They were here. He lowered the concrete panel back into place, the lock sealing with a soft click just as he heard the telltale sound of the loft's main door being breached. He descended into the cold, musty dark, the smell of old paper and dust filling his nostrils. The chase led down 3 floors into the sub-basement, connecting to a labyrinth of forgotten service tunnels that ran beneath the Brooklyn streets. Upstairs, Carter's team swept through the loft. It was a ghost town. Clear, he announced into his comms. No hostiles. He surveyed the room. But he was here. Systems are fried. Everything's been wiped and then physically disabled. Jessica's voice came through his earpiece. Anything left behind? Any clues? Carter walked towards the workbench, his rifle light cutting through the gloom. Just one, he said, focusing his camera on the single playing card lying in the center of the clean surface. In the command van, Jessica zoomed in on the image on her screen. The Joker, a card of chaos, of wild unpredictability. It was a message, a taunt. He was telling her that he wasn't playing by the rules, that he was the wild card in her carefully controlled game. A flicker of something that might have been admiration, quickly suppressed by cold fury, passed through her. Check every possible exit, she commanded. Sublevels, service tunnels, sewer access. He's on foot. Box him in. But it was too late. 2 blocks away, a manhole cover in the middle of a quiet side street lifted a few inches. Leo Vance slipped out, replacing the cover without a sound. He pulled up the hood of his sweatshirt, melting into the first wave of morning commuters heading for the subway. He was exposed, his sanctuary gone, his resources limited to what he carried in his bag. He was no longer the unseen puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows. He was on the run, but he had the drive, and he had a destination. The hunt for Eris Thorne was no longer a calculated project. It was a desperate race for survival. The New York City subway system is a river of humanity, a place where a ghost can easily drown. Leo Vance, now stripped of his tailored suit and sophisticated tech, became just another nameless face in the morning rush. At a locker in a 24-hour laundromat in Queens, he shed his old skin. The tuxedo was replaced with worn jeans, a faded hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low. He swapped his expensive shoes for scuffed work boots and put on a pair of non-prescription glasses that subtly changed the shape of his face. Leo Vance was gone. In his place was Alex Cole, a freelance journalist with a tired expression and a backstory as unremarkable as his outfit. He knew Jessica Albright would be locking down the city. Airports would be monitored, bus and train stations flagged. Facial recognition software would be scanning every major intersection. To leave through conventional means would be to walk directly into her net. So he took the path of chaos. A local commuter train to the city limits, a cash-only cab ride to a neighboring state, and finally, a long, anonymous bus journey from a small town that wasn't even on Jessica's primary radar. He was a ripple, spreading outwards from the stone she had thrown into his pond. Back in Manhattan, frustration was mounting in Jessica's command center. Her digital dragnet had come up empty. The financial decoy in Iceland had been a clever, time-consuming diversion. The man had simply vanished from the most surveilled city on Earth. He's not using his face, and he's not using his money, Jessica said to Carter, pacing in front of a bank of monitors. He's reverted to analog. Expand the search. I want reports on any stolen vehicles within a 20-block radius of the target's last known position. Flag any long-haul taxi services paid for in cash. He's moving, and he's leaving footprints, no matter how faint. Find them. She was hunting a phantom, and it was becoming a personal obsession. 300 miles away, Alex Cole stepped off a bus into the crisp autumn air of Ithaca, New York. The contrast was jarring. The frantic, vertical energy of Manhattan was replaced by rolling hills, ivy-covered stone buildings, and a quiet intellectualism that seemed to permeate the very air. The slower pace was a balm, but also a new kind of danger. In New York, anonymity was a crowd. Here, it was a quiet street where every new face was noticed. He found what he was looking for in a classified ad pinned to a bulletin board in a local coffee shop, a room for rent in a sprawling old house occupied by graduate students who were too busy with their own theses to ask questions. He paid the deposit in cash, giving a vague story about researching a book on local folklore. His room was small and sparse, but it had a sturdy lock and a window overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. It would do. His only piece of technology was the burner laptop he'd carried in his go bag, and his only link to his past life was the hardened drive containing the horrors of Project Chimera. He couldn't risk connecting to the local Wi-Fi. Instead, he used a complex series of signal relays, bouncing his connection through 3 different countries before it ever touched the public internet. It was slow and cumbersome, but it kept him invisible. His search for Eris Thorn began not with a name, but with a ghost signature, the Deadless, post on the biohacking forum. The subject was protein folding, a niche within a niche. The place to start was the university, the intellectual heart of the town. Posing as a writer researching an article on the history of computational biology, he spent the next day in the university's science library. He wasn't looking for a person. He was hunting for a reputation. He sifted through old department newsletters, academic journals, and archived student forums from 6 years ago. He was searching for any mention of a brilliant, reclusive consultant, an outside expert, or an eccentric genius who might have helped students with a particularly thorny problem. By the end of the day, he had nothing but a strain and a growing sense of futility. Just as he was about to leave, he struck up a conversation with the archivist, a semi-retired professor named Dr. Albright, a man with a kind face and a love for storytelling. Leo, as Alex, mentioned the specific protein folding problem. The professor's eyes lit up with a faint spark of memory. Oh, Deadless. Yes, I remember that. A devil of a problem. Stumped some of my best doctoral candidates for months. Did they ever solve it? Leo asked, keeping his tone casual. They had help, the professor said, leaning back in his chair. From an old friend of the department. Not officially, of course. He was eccentric, never came to campus, lived a very private life up by the lake. Leo felt his pulse quicken. A professor? Oh, heavens no. Not for a long time. He was a brilliant mind, one of the best I've ever known, but he had a falling out with the mainstream academic world. A falling out with his family, too, as I recall. We just called him the lighthouse keeper. The lighthouse keeper? Leo echoed, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. Yes, the professor chuckled. Partly because he lived in an old, isolated house on the shore of Cayuga Lake, and partly because he would occasionally send out these brilliant flashes of light, solutions to impossible problems through encrypted emails, guiding the rest of us lost ships in the academic fog. Haven't heard from him in years, though. I imagine he's still up there, watching the water. Leo thanked the professor for his time, his mind racing. A nickname and a location. The ghost finally had a shadow. That evening, in his small rented room, Leo Vance looked at a map of Cayuga Lake. It was a vast, dark body of water, over 30 miles long, its shores dotted with small towns and long stretches of isolated woodland. Somewhere along that coastline was a reclusive genius, a man who held the key to Project Chimera. Somewhere out there, in the quiet darkness, was the lighthouse keeper, and Leo knew he had to find him before Jessica Albright's hunters found him first. A name and a general location were not a solution. They were merely the start of a new, more dangerous puzzle. Cayuga Lake was a vast expanse of dark water and dense shoreline, dotted with hundreds of isolated homes. Finding one specific recluse, a man who had mastered the art of disappearance, was like searching for a single quiet breath in the middle of a storm. Leo knew that a direct, digital approach would be fruitless. Eris Thorn would have long ago scrubbed his name from any public-facing databases. Leo's strategy, therefore, had to be indirect. He spent his first 48 hours in Ithaca's county records office, still wearing the unthreatening guise of Alex Cole, the freelance writer. He patiently sifted through digital property deeds, tax assessments, and utility grids. He wasn't searching for the name, Eris Thorn. He was searching for an anomaly, a property bought decades ago by a shell corporation, an address with an electricity consumption 5 times higher than its neighbors, suggesting powerful computers or lab equipment. A home with no mortgage, no liens, no digital paper trail whatsoever. He found 3 possibilities, 3 properties that were effectively ghosts in the system. But they were scattered miles apart along the shoreline. A physical reconnaissance was necessary, and that carried its own risks. Every public appearance, every conversation, every moment spent out in the open was a chance for his face to be logged by a security camera or remembered by a curious local. He was a man walking through a minefield, trying not to leave footprints. Meanwhile, the hunt for him continued. In her New York City command post, Jessica Albright was growing impatient. The trail had gone completely cold. Her web of surveillance covering the tri-state area had caught nothing. He's not using cars, trains, or planes, she reasoned aloud to her team. He's not using credit cards or phones. He has gone completely analog. This means he's slow, but it also means he's deliberate. He didn't just run. He ran to something. Her gaze shifted to the giant screen on the wall, which displayed everything they knew about their target. The sparse details, the single clear photo of his face, the image of the Joker card he'd left behind. "Stop chasing the ghost," she ordered, her voice cutting through the room. "Let's start hunting his reasons."
"I want to know what was on that drive."
"Carter, get a team digging into Marcus Thorne's past. Not the public version. I want every rumor, every sealed document, every skeleton he has ever buried. Find me the one secret he would risk everything to protect. The secret he would hide in plain sight on a $50 million necklace." Jessica's instinct was sharp. She knew that to find a man like Leo Vance, she had to understand his destination. And now, unknowingly, she was beginning to walk the same path he had, a path that led directly to the fractured history of the Thorne brothers. Leo decided he needed a new perspective. The land was a dead end, so he turned to the water. He paid cash to rent a small, weathered fishing boat from a sleepy marina, the kind of nondescript vessel that blended in with dozens of others on the lake. For 2 days, he chugged slowly along the coastline, keeping a safe distance from the shore. He used a pair of high-powered binoculars to study the 3 properties he had identified. The first was a modern glass house, beautiful but too open, too exposed. The second was a dilapidated cabin, clearly abandoned for years. The third was promising, a large, older home, surrounded by a high fence and a thicket of trees, with visible security cameras mounted on the corners of the roof. But it felt cold, corporate. It felt like one of Thorne's safe houses, not the sanctuary of a reclusive scientist. He felt a gnawing sense of being back at square one. That evening, cold and weary, he docked the boat at a different marina on the opposite side of the lake and went into the adjoining dive bar for a hot meal. The place was nearly empty, save for an old, grizzled bartender wiping down glasses. Seeking a new approach, Leo engaged him in conversation, using his writer persona. "I'm collecting stories," Leo said, nursing a cup of black coffee. "Local legends, ghost stories, that sort of thing. Any interesting characters who live out on the lake?" The bartender let out a dry chuckle. "Son, everyone who lives on the lake year-round is an interesting character. But you want a ghost story? I'll give you one." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You see that peninsula way out there, where the old lighthouse used to be? That's Blackwood Point. And there's a man who lives out there. Been there for the better part of 15 years. Leo's senses went on high alert, but he kept his expression neutral, curious. "An old fisherman? Nobody knows," the bartender scoffed. "And nobody asks. You don't go to Blackwood Point. The property is private, fenced off. We never see him. Never. The only sign of life is the lights, which are on at all hours of the night, and the supply drones. Once a month, like clockwork, a big, unmarked drone flies in from the south, drops a payload, and flies out. No boats, no cars, no visitors. Nothing." "What do people say he is?" Leo asked. "Anything you can imagine. A paranoid billionaire. A federal witness in hiding." "Me? I think he's a scientist. One of those disgraced types who did something he shouldn't have. Either way, he's the real ghost of Cayuga Lake." Leo paid for his meal, his mind reeling. A house on a point, isolated, receiving drone deliveries, its occupant a complete mystery. It wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. He had found him. He stepped outside into the cold night air. Across the vast, ink-black water, he could just make out a faint, solitary glimmer of light miles away. It was a beacon in the darkness. It was Blackwood Point. He had found the lighthouse. Now, he had to figure out how to get to the keeper. Finding the lighthouse was one thing, approaching it was another entirely. Leo knew that a man who would go to such lengths to disappear would not welcome visitors. Blackwood Point wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, and its architect, Eris Thorne, would be a master of paranoia. A direct approach would be suicide. This required the finesse of a heist, not the blunt force of an invasion. Back in the anonymity of his rented room, Leo began his surveillance. He used his heavily masked internet connection to pull every available piece of data on Blackwood Point. Satellite imagery, geological surveys, old property blueprints from before Eris had purchased it. A digital picture of the fortress began to form, and it was even more formidable than he had imagined. The peninsula was a natural stronghold. It was connected to the mainland by a single, narrow causeway, which satellite photos showed was blocked by a formidable concrete and steel gate. The perimeter was lined with pressure sensors, microwave tripwires, and a network of cameras that likely had thermal and night vision capabilities. The house itself was modest, but its roof bristled with a sophisticated array of antennas and sensors. This was the home of a man who had built a digital wall around his physical one. He wasn't just keeping people out, he was watching for any attempt to get in. As Leo was probing the digital walls of heiress Thorn's sanctuary, Jessica Albright was busy excavating the ruins of his past. Her team, following her orders, had bypassed the official corporate records of Marcus Thorn and had begun digging into sealed court documents and old police reports. They found what she was looking for: the story of heiress Thorn. The official narrative was clean and tragic. A brilliant scientist suffers a psychotic break, becomes violent and delusional, and is eventually disowned by his family for his own good. But Jessica saw the inconsistencies. The restraining order Marcus had filed against his brother was based on the testimony of employees who were all given massive promotions immediately afterward. The psychiatrist who diagnosed Eris lost his license 2 years later for falsifying patient records. The disappearance itself was too neat, too clean. This wasn't a family tragedy, Jessica said to Carter, pointing at the timeline on her screen. This was an extraction. Marcus didn't banish his brother. He buried him. Find out where. Search for any properties purchased through shell corporations controlled by Thorn's inner circle 15 years ago. Look for properties with high security specs, isolated, preferably with their own power generation. Eris is alive, and he is the key to all of this. Jessica didn't have a location yet, but she now had a name. She was no longer hunting a nameless ghost. She was hunting the brother of her own boss. Leo, studying the impenetrable defenses of Blackwood Point, came to a similar conclusion. There was no way through the front door, digital or physical. He had to find another way. Every perfect system has a flaw, not in its design, but in its routine. The bartender had given him the key, the monthly supply drone. It was the one predictable interaction Eris had with the outside world. It was the mail slot in the fortress wall. It was his Trojan horse. His mission was no longer about finding Eris, but about understanding that delivery. He needed to know the drone's flight path, its schedule, its make and model. Using his knowledge of commercial and military drone frequencies, he set his laptop to perform a passive, long-range scan of the airspace over the lake, hoping to catch the ghost of a signal. For the next 3 days, he returned to his fishing boat, anchoring in a hidden cove that gave him a clear, distant line of sight to the peninsula. The waiting was a form of meditation. He watched the fortress through his binoculars, learning its rhythms. He saw the small, automated ground rovers that patrolled the fence line every 4 hours. He noted the sweep patterns of the cameras. The place was a perfectly synchronized, self-contained machine. On the 4th evening, as the sun bled into the dark water of the lake, he saw it. A subtle shift in the machine's rhythm. A small mast on the roof of the house, previously dormant, began to emit a soft, pulsing light, a frequency invisible to the naked eye but clear as day through the infrared scope of his binoculars. It was a homing beacon. He checked his laptop. The airwave scan, previously silent, was now alive with activity. It had picked up an encrypted, high-frequency signal from the south. Cross-referencing the signal's telemetry with a flight database, he identified it. A heavy-lift, long-range delivery drone. Its registered flight plan was logged under a generic agricultural survey company, a clear smokescreen. Its point of origin was a private airfield in rural Pennsylvania, and its destination, its final waypoint, was the pulsing beacon on the roof of the house at Blackwood Point. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him. The delivery wasn't coming in a few weeks or a few days. The drone was already in the air. Its estimated time of arrival was just after midnight. He had spent days trying to figure out how to knock on the door of the most reclusive man in the country. Now, the door was about to swing open, just for a moment. He had less than 6 hours to devise and execute a plan to slip through that opening, a plan with zero margin for error. The waiting game was over. The heist was on. There was no time for a perfect plan. Perfection was a luxury afforded by time, and Leo had mere hours. Chaos, however, was an old friend. He returned to his rented room in a state of controlled urgency, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and risks. He emptied his go bag onto the bed. A length of high-tensile microfilament rope, a collapsible grappling hook, a set of compact cutting tools, and a small, handmade device with a simple switch, a localized RF jammer designed to create a small bubble of electronic silence. It was a meager arsenal for storming a fortress. It would have to be enough. His plan was audacious, bordering on insane, born of sheer necessity. He couldn't go through the gate. He couldn't scale the fences. He couldn't hack the system. So, he would arrive by air as an uninvited guest on the only vessel cleared for landing, the supply drone. He piloted the small fishing boat back out onto the lake, the engine a low thrum against the profound silence of the night. The water was black as polished obsidian, mirroring a starless, overcast sky. It was the perfect cover. He killed the engine a quarter-mile from the shore of Blackwood Point, letting the boat drift in the radar shadow of the peninsula's steep cliffs. The waiting began, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. In a sterile office hundreds of miles away, a data analyst on Jessica Albright's team stared at his screen, his eyes wide. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice cutting through the low hum of the servers. "I've got a match. A property on Cayuga Lake, a peninsula called Blackwood Point, purchased 15 years ago by a holding company that traces back to Marcus Thorne's personal lawyer. It's got its own power station, a satellite uplink, and the property taxes are paid automatically from an untraceable offshore account. This is it." Jessica was at his side in an instant. The satellite image on the screen showed an isolated house, a high perimeter fence, a single access road. It was a private prison. "He's there," she whispered, a grim certainty in her voice. "He's been there all this time." She turned to Carter. "Scramble the tactical team. I want a helicopter in the air 30 minutes ago. Full extraction protocol. Thorne will want his brother alive, but my priority is the man who went in there to find him. I want Leo Vance." The race was no longer a question of miles, but of minutes. Leo heard it before he saw it. A low, powerful hum that vibrated through the water and into the hull of his boat. The sound grew steadily, a deep thrumming that was less like an engine and more like the angry buzz of a colossal insect. Then, its lights appeared, cutting through the darkness to the south. The drone was bigger than he'd anticipated, a sleek, military-grade octocopter the size of a small car, its rotors tearing at the air. It followed a precise, unvarying flight path, one that would take it directly over his position before it began its final approach to the house. This was his only chance. As the drone roared overhead, its downdraft churning the surface of the lake, Leo stood up in the rocking boat, aimed the grappling hook, and fired. The hook shot upwards, a metal claw against the night sky. For a heart-stopping second, he thought he had missed. Then, he heard a solid clang as the hook caught on a reinforced strut of the drone's landing gear. The microfilament line snapped taut, yanking him out of the boat and into the air with a force that nearly tore his arms from their sockets. He dangled 50 feet above the churning water, the world a dizzying blur of wind and noise. The boat, now empty, drifted away into the darkness. There was no going back. With grim determination, he began to climb, hand over hand, his muscles screaming in protest. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from his lifeline. Below him, the jagged rocks of the Blackwood Point shoreline grew closer. He reached the undercarriage of the drone just as it crossed the perimeter fence. He scrambled to find a secure position, wedging himself between a cargo container and the landing strut. From his precarious perch, he could see the compound's automated security systems below. The ground rovers paused in their patrols, their optical sensors angled upwards, acknowledging the drone's authorized arrival. The cameras followed its progress. They saw the expected delivery. They did not see the human parasite clinging to its belly. The house loomed larger, the landing pad on its flat roof glowing with a ring of soft white lights. The drone's engine pitch changed as it began its final, gentle descent. This was the most dangerous moment. The landing pad would be a sterile, exposed environment. There would be no cover. He held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold metal. The drone lowered itself with unnerving precision. 10 feet, 5 feet. The landing gear extended, threatening to crush him. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he unclipped the grappling hook, swung his body away from the descending machinery, and dropped the last few feet onto the roof. He landed in a crouch, his body absorbing the impact, a silent shadow born from the belly of the machine. The drone settled onto its charging points with a soft hiss of hydraulics. A hatch on the roof opened, and a robotic arm emerged, preparing to unload the cargo. He had made it. He was past the walls, inside the fortress, standing on the very roof of the lighthouse keeper's tower. But he was also trapped, exposed under the cold, clinical lights, with only seconds before his presence was discovered. The heist was over. The infiltration had begun. The rooftop was an island of stark, artificial light in a sea of darkness. The drone settled onto its charging cradle with a final, soft hiss, its rotors powering down. A robotic arm, emerging from a sleek panel on the roof, began its work, methodically unloading crates from the drone's cargo bay. For Leo, the silence that followed the engine's roar was more terrifying than the noise. He was exposed, a living, breathing anomaly in a world of automated perfection. He moved in a low crouch, his eyes scanning for any kind of cover or entry point. He spotted it near the center of the roof, a heavy, reinforced steel hatch, flush with the surface. A single red LED glowed on its control panel, indicating it was sealed and alarmed. He had seconds. The drone's unloading procedure was likely timed. Once it was finished, the system's diagnostics would register an unaccounted-for variable, the weight and heat signature of a human being. Pulling the RF jammer from his bag, he thumbed the switch. The small device emitted a low hum, creating an invisible 3-foot bubble of electronic silence. He pressed it against the hatch's control panel. The red LED flickered and died. It wouldn't last long, but it would give him a window. His lockpicks moved with a surgeon's deftness. The lock was complex, a magnetic tumbler system designed to resist brute force. But Leo wasn't using force. He was listening, feeling the faint clicks of the mechanism, persuading it to open. Just as the robotic arm slid the last crate into its receptacle and retracted into the roof, the lock gave way with a satisfying thunk. Leo pulled the heavy hatch open, slipped into the darkness below, and sealed it silently behind him. He was in. He found himself in a narrow maintenance shaft, the air cool and tasting of filtered ozone. He descended a short ladder into the building proper, his senses on high alert. The interior of the house was nothing like he'd expected. It was not a home. It was a laboratory, a library, and a terrarium, all fused into one. The silence was absolute. He moved through sterile white corridors that opened into vast, glass-walled rooms. In one, strange, bioluminescent plants grew in spiraling hydroponic towers, casting an ethereal blue and green glow. Another was a server farm, the rhythmic blinking of countless tiny lights the only sign of the immense data being processed within. It was the sanctuary of a brilliant mind that had systematically cut itself off from the world and built a new one of its own. It was a place of profound genius and even more profound loneliness. Leo followed the flow of the architecture, sensing that all the corridors must lead to a central nexus. As he rounded a corner, he found it, a circular room, a control center, where the walls themselves were a seamless, 360-degree monitor displaying everything from weather patterns to complex genetic code. And in the center of the room, sitting in a simple chair, was a man. He was older than Leo had pictured, perhaps in his late 50s, with a lean frame, a tangle of graying hair, and eyes that were shockingly sharp and intelligent. He wasn't surprised or afraid. He was watching Leo's approach on one small section of the panoramic screen. The thermal sensors on the landing struts registered a weight discrepancy of 82 kilograms the moment the drone touched down. The man said, his voice raspy from disuse but steady, "An anomaly. You are remarkably quiet for an anomaly." This was Eris Thorn, the lighthouse keeper, and he had been waiting. "My brother's usual employees are far less subtle," Eris continued, his eyes never leaving the screen that showed Leo. "They prefer to knock, loudly. So, the question is, who are you?" Leo stepped out of the shadows and into the center of the room. The game was over. The time for stealth and misdirection was gone. "My name is Leo Vance," he said, "and your brother is the reason I'm here." Eris finally turned in his chair to look at Leo directly. There was no fear in his gaze, only a deep, weary curiosity. "If Marcus sent you, you're either here to kill me or to retrieve something. Given your methods, I'm guessing the latter. Unfortunately for you, I have nothing that he wants." "You're wrong," Leo said, walking forward and placing the small, hardened drive on the console in front of Eris. "He wants this back, desperately." Eris stared at the drive, his brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't seen it before. "I took it from him," Leo explained, his voice low and urgent. "It contains every file, every piece of research, every victim of a project I believe you started. Project Chimera." The name hit Eris like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. The analytical calm in his eyes shattered, replaced by a storm of horror and pain. All the ghosts of his past had just materialized in this room, held within a tiny piece of metal and silicon. "That's not possible," Eris whispered, his gaze fixed on the drive. "He promised he destroyed it all." "He lied," Leo said, leaning in closer. "He continued your work, and he's been covering his tracks for 15 years. But now he knows the data is gone. He knows I have it, which is why he sent a team, not to knock, but to clean house. They're not coming for the drive, Eris. They're coming to erase the last living person who knows the truth of what's on it. They are coming for you, and based on my estimates, they'll be here in less than an hour." The silence in the room returned, but this time it was heavy, suffocating. The full, terrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon the man who had hidden from the world for a decade and a half. The world had just found him. For a long moment, Eris Thorn did not move. He simply stared at the small, dark drive on his console, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The sanctuary he had built to escape his past had just become its tomb. Leo's words hung in the air, a death sentence with a 1-hour deadline. Then, with a sudden, convulsive movement, Eris snatched the drive and plugged it into his terminal. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, his own master-level encryptions falling away like dust. The files bloomed across the main screen. He didn't need to read the details. The titles and genetic markers were enough. It was his work, his research, but twisted into something monstrous. Sickness and death were coded into the elegant language of life he had once sought to heal. "He promised me," Eris whispered, his voice cracking. "After I fled, he swore he had destroyed all of it." His head snapped up, his eyes meeting Leo's, now burning with a cold, terrifying fury. "He didn't just continue my work. He perfected it." "What was it?" Leo asked, his voice low. "What is Project Chimera?" "A cure," Eris said, turning from the screen to a large panel on the wall, his hands typing in a series of commands. The lights in the room shifted to a deep, urgent red. It was meant to be a universal cure, a way to use a benign retrovirus to deliver custom-designed DNA sequences directly into a patient's cells. "We could have cured cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, any genetic disorder. We could have ended hereditary suffering." He explained as he worked, his words a clipped, frantic torrent of information. He was initiating a full system purge, a protocol designed to melt down every server and storage device in the compound. He was destroying his life's work and his brother's. "But my brother, Marcus doesn't see tools," Eris continued, his voice laced with a 15-year-old bitterness. "He sees weapons. He saw a technology that could not only cure a disease, but could also deliver one. A targeted biological agent that could wipe out a population with a specific genetic marker. A way to enhance soldiers, to create monsters. He saw the devil's blueprint in my design for a miracle." Their argument had been the stuff of legends within the old company. Eris, horrified, had tried to destroy the research. Marcus, seeing billions in potential power, had stopped him. Eris had fled, a ghost running from the monster he felt he had created. "There's no time," Leo cut in, his eyes glancing at a ticking clock on the wall. "Your brother's monster is at the door. How do we get out of here?" "This place was a sanctuary," Eris said, pulling a heavy steel panel from the wall to reveal a hidden elevator. "But I was never naive enough to believe it couldn't become a cage." He gestured for Leo to enter. "There is one way out, a path I built for a day I prayed would never come." As the elevator descended, a new scene flashed across the news channels. The city was in an uproar. The stock market was in freefall. A massive leak of data had exposed the criminal underpinnings of Marcus Thorn's empire. The financial crimes Leo had ignored were now public, a devastating blow to Thorn's reputation and wealth. In a helicopter tearing through the night sky toward Ithaca, Jessica Albright saw the news alerts on her tablet. She felt a cold knot in her stomach. The Joker. He hadn't just taken the drive for its primary secret. He had used the financial data as a secondary attack, a massive, timed distraction. He had set the world on fire to keep them busy while he went for the real prize. Her respect for her adversary grew, as did her determination to capture him. 2 minutes to insertion point, the pilot's voice crackled in her ear. On her screen, a thermal image showed the peninsula. "I have 2 distinct heat signatures, ma'am, both in the main structure, moving downwards. They're on the run." The elevator carrying Leo and Eris opened into a vast, cavernous space carved from the bedrock beneath the lake. The air was cool and damp. In the center of a deep, dark pool of water rested a sleek, two-person submersible, its black hull looking like some deep-sea predator. This was Eris's lifeboat. It's been dormant for over a decade, Eris said, running to a control panel and flipping a series of switches. The power cells will need a moment to prime. A low hum filled the cavern as the submersible began to come to life. "We don't have a moment," Leo said, pointing to a monitor that showed the exterior security feeds. In the distance, beyond the trees, the flashing navigation lights of a helicopter were growing steadily brighter. Eris's face was pale in the flashing red light of the console. "To open the tunnel doors to the lake, I have to trigger a full security override. It's the only way. But the second I do, it will send a Priority 1 alert directly to my brother's security network. They'll know exactly what we're doing. They will know where we are." Leo looked from the approaching helicopter on the screen to the submersible, still powering up in the dark water. Jessica's team would be descending on the house above them at any second. Eris looked at Leo, his hand hovering over the large, final activation button. "It's now or never," Leo said, his voice grim. Eris took a deep breath, the breath of a man leaving his whole world behind, and slammed his palm down on the button. The moment Eris's palm hit the override, the sanctuary of Blackwood Point became a blaring, screaming trap. Emergency lights pulsed, casting the cavern in a hellish red glow as a klaxon echoed off the damp rock walls. Across the subterranean pool, a section of the cavern wall, seamless only moments before, began to grind open with the sound of a waking giant, revealing the cold, black water of Cayuga Lake. "Get in," Eris yelled over the noise, already scrambling toward the open hatch of the submersible. Leo followed, pulling himself into the cramped cockpit and sealing the heavy door behind them. Inside, the cacophony of the alarms was replaced by the low, urgent hum of the vessel systems coming to life. The cockpit was a tight, two-seat bubble of screens and controls, the air thick with the smell of dormant electronics. "It needs 90 seconds to prime the main reactor," Eris shouted, his hands a blur as he strapped himself in and flicked switches. It's been in cold sleep for 15 years. On a small monitor displaying the compound's security feed, Leo watched the nightmare unfold. A helicopter, sleek and black as a raptor, was descending rapidly. Figures in dark tactical gear were rappelling down, landing silently on the roof he had stood on not 20 minutes earlier. Aboard that helicopter, Jessica Albright's tablet lit up with a Priority 1 alert. A schematic of the subterranean dock and the powering up submersible filled her screen. "He has a sub," she said, her voice a mix of cold fury and grudging respect. The Joker was a man of infinite surprises. She didn't hesitate. "All teams, change of plan. He's running underwater. Alpha team, your entry point is the main house. Fight your way down. Your objective is that dock. Neutralize the submersible. Bravo team, rappel to the western shoreline. I want eyes and rifles on that tunnel exit. He does not reach the open water." Inside the sub, the countdown on the main screen ticked down. 60 seconds. Leo watched the tactical team on his monitor. "They've breached the house," he said, his voice grimly calm. "They're on the main floor, moving fast." He could hear the faint, percussive sounds of the assault through the hull, muffled explosions as they breached doors, the distant chatter of suppressed gunfire. They were fighting their way through Eris's automated defenses. 45 seconds. "The internal defenses won't hold them for long," Eris muttered, his eyes darting across a dozen flashing diagnostic screens. "They're professionals." The low hum of the reactor was rising in pitch, the vessel around them beginning to vibrate with contained power. 30 seconds. "They're in the lower labs," Leo reported. He could see them on the camera feed, moving with brutal efficiency, sweeping through the corridors he had walked just minutes ago. "They'll be at the elevator in seconds." 15 seconds. The main screen in front of Eris flashed green. "Reactor online. All systems nominal." "Hold on," Eris said, his hands gripping the controls. With a surge of power that pressed both men back into their seats, the submersible's engines roared to life. The small vessel shot forward, sliding from its cradle and into the dark water of the tunnel just as the cavern doors behind them were blasted open by an explosive charge. Alpha Team flooded the dock, their weapons raised, but their target was already gone, a ghost disappearing down a dark throat of rock and water. The tunnel was a claustrophobic tube, the sub's powerful headlights cutting a lonely beam through the absolute blackness. "They're behind us, but they can't follow us in here," Eris said, a hint of triumph in his voice. "They don't have to," Leo countered, pointing to the forward-facing sonar display. "They're waiting for us at the exit." As if on cue, a blindingly bright light flooded the end of the tunnel. It was the helicopter's searchlight, aimed directly down into the water, turning their exit into a stage. Then came the explosion. It wasn't a direct hit, but it was close. Jessica's team, positioned on the shore, had dropped a small depth charge near the tunnel's mouth. The shockwave hit them like a physical hammer blow, tossing the small sub like a toy. Alarms shrieked in the cockpit as the lights flickered. A hairline crack appeared on the reinforced acrylic of the canopy viewport. "They're trying to collapse the tunnel," Eris yelled, fighting to keep the sub from smashing against the rock walls. Debris and silt clouded the water in front of them. Through the chaos, Leo saw the light of the open lake.
Go. Now.
Eris slammed the throttle to its maximum. The sub surged forward, a final, desperate burst of speed. It shot out of the tunnel mouth just as tons of rock and earth collapsed behind them, sealing the ghost's exit forever. They were out. They were free. But as they surfaced in the frigid night air, the helicopter's searchlight pinned them perfectly. They were a tiny, vulnerable vessel in the middle of a vast, dark lake, and the hunter's eye was staring right at them. The world outside the submersible's canopy became a blinding white glare. The helicopter's searchlight pinned them, turning their small vessel into a brightly lit target on a vast, black stage. For a frozen second, they were like insects trapped in a jar. "Dive," Leo yelled, the command snapping Eris out of his momentary paralysis. Eris slammed the controls forward, forcing the submersible into a steep, bone-jarring descent. It was not a moment too soon. The water's surface, where they had been just a second before, erupted in a spray of white foam as a stream of bullets from the helicopter stitched a line across the lake. They plunged into the cold, silent depths. The blinding light from above was quickly swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the deep water, replaced by the soft, internal glow of the cockpit's instruments. They were running blind, relying only on their sonar and Eris's 15-year-old memory of the lakebed. Aboard the chopper, Jessica Albright watched the red blip of the submersible on her sonar screen. "He's deep," she said into her headset, her voice sharp with command. "He'll try to use the terrain to lose us. I want a constant lock on him. Deploy the active sonar pinger." A technician beside her launched a small buoy from the side of the helicopter. It hit the water and immediately began emitting a high-frequency pulse, relentless ping that would follow the submersible and paint a clear picture for its hunters. Inside the cockpit, the sound of the pinger was a jarring, invasive presence. It was the sound of the net closing. "Active sonar," Eris said, his knuckles white on the controls. "We can't outrun it. This vessel was built for stealth and research, not for speed." As the submersible descended deeper, the pressure increased. A thin, steady trickle of icy water began to seep from the hairline crack in the canopy, the result of the earlier depth charge. The water dripped onto the control panel with a quiet, maddening rhythm. "Hull integrity at 90% and falling," Eris warned, his eyes fixed on a pressure gauge. "That shockwave did more damage than I thought. We can't go much deeper, or the canopy will implode." They were trapped, too slow to outrun the hunter on the surface, and too damaged to escape into the crushing pressure of the depths. Leo's mind raced, falling back on the old, familiar patterns of the trickster. If you can't outrun them, and you can't outfight them, you have to misdirect them. "We can't outrun the sonar," Leo said, his eyes on the tactical display, "but maybe we can confuse it. Is there any cover down here? Anything that can create a lot of noise? A wreck, a canyon, anything?" Eris was silent for a moment, his mind's eye mapping the dark world outside. Then he nodded. "There is one place," he said, banking the submersible sharply to the east. "The locals call it the Devil's Teeth. It's a submerged ridge of shale rock, very treacherous, full of spires and narrow passages. It creates a sonar echo chamber. No one goes near it. Take us there," Leo ordered, "and get ready to go silent." On Jessica's screen, the red blip of the submersible suddenly changed course, heading directly for a known navigational hazard. "What is he doing?" Carter asked from the seat beside her. "He's desperate," Jessica replied, a flicker of a smile on her lips. "He's running into the one place he thinks we won't follow. Maintain pursuit." Eris was a virtuoso at the controls, guiding the small vessel through the ghostly, skeletal shapes of the devil's teeth. The sonar pings became chaotic, echoing off dozens of rock faces at once, turning Jessica's clear tactical display into a confusing snowstorm of false signals. The sub's headlights illuminated a terrifying, alien landscape of stone spires reaching up from the abyss like the fingers of a drowned god.
Now,
Leo said. Following the plan they had hastily formed, Eris found a small crevice between two massive rock pillars. He expertly maneuvered the sub into the narrow space, the hull scraping against the stone. Then he hit a single switch. Reactors shut down. The low hum of the engines died. The internal lights faded to a bare minimum of emergency power. The cockpit was plunged into a near-total, claustrophobic darkness. They were adrift, a silent steel coffin resting on the bottom of the lake. Outside, the only sound was the rhythmic, sweeping ping, ping, ping of the hunter's sonar, searching for them in the maze of rock. And inside, a new sound became terrifyingly loud. The slow, steady drip, drip, drip of lake water from the cracked canopy, a constant reminder of their failing hull and the immense, crushing weight of the water above them. Leo and Eris sat in the cold and the dark, not daring to breathe, listening to the sound of the predator circling overhead. They had laid their trap, their bluff. Now, all they could do was wait and see if the hunter would swim past. Silence. The cockpit was a cold, dark tomb, suspended in the crushing blackness of the lake bed. The only sounds were the rhythmic ping, ping, ping of the sonar sweeping the water above and the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of the leak from the cracked canopy. It was the sound of a clock ticking down on their lives. Eris sat rigid in his seat, his breathing shallow. 15 years of perfect, controlled isolation had not prepared him for this. The chaos, the chase, the imminent threat of death. It was a sensory overload that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed composure. His knuckles were white where he gripped the dormant controls. Leo, in contrast, was a study in calm. He was in his element, cornered, outgunned, and relying on nothing but nerve and a well-played bluff. He watched the tactical display, which showed the sonar waves washing over their position, again and again. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. The leak, though small, was a fatal symptom. Aboard the helicopter, Jessica Albright stared at the chaotic sonar returns from the devil's teeth. The clean, red blip of the submersible had vanished into a snowstorm of false echoes. Her instinct screamed that he was down there, hiding. A ghost in the machine. But instinct wasn't evidence, and she was losing time. Drop one more charge, she commanded. Not on top of them. 100 yards to the north. A concussion blast. Let's see if we can flush the rabbit from its hole. The explosion was a dull, distant thump, but the shockwave that followed was brutally intimate. It slammed into the submersible, shaking the small vessel with violent force. A web of new cracks spread from the initial fracture in the canopy. The dripping sound intensified, becoming a steady, unnerving trickle. Eris flinched, his hand instinctively reaching for the reactor controls. They've found us. We have to move. No, Leo said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. He placed a hand on Eris's arm. This is a test. He's knocking on the cage to see if anything rattles. If we move, if we make a single sound, we're dead. We wait. They sat in the terrifying silence, the trickle of water a constant, cold reminder of their failing sanctuary. On the helicopter, Jessica watched her screens. Nothing. No flicker of an engine. No desperate attempt to flee. Just the silent, echoing rocks. Fuel status is critical, the pilot announced. We need to return to base. Jessica's jaw tightened. She hated leaving a job unfinished. They're either dead or they're very, very good, she said softly, more to herself than to her team. She made a decision.
All right, pull back.
I want a hard perimeter on the entire lake. Block every road, every boat launch. They can't stay in the water forever. When they surface, we'll be waiting. The deep thrum of the helicopter's rotors faded. The relentless sonar pings grew fainter, then vanished completely. Silence. A true, profound silence this time. They had done it. The hunter was gone. The relief was a physical thing, a wave that left both men limp in their seats. But it was short-lived. The reality of their situation remained. Okay, Leo said, breaking the quiet. Damage report. Eris, seeming to pull his scattered intellect back together, ran a diagnostic. The news was grim. The canopy is critically compromised. It won't survive another deep dive, and a rapid ascent could shatter it completely. Life support is stable, but based on our oxygen reserves and the atmospheric pressure, we have maybe 3 hours of breathable air. The reactor is functional, but the primary battery is drained. We have one power-up left. One chance to get to the surface and to shore. Surfacing is not an option, Leo stated flatly. She'll have this entire lake surrounded. We'd be caught before we took 5 steps on dry land. He looked at Eris, the man who had made this lake his entire world for 15 years. You lived here for a decade and a half. You watched this place, studied it. Is there another way? A back door? Eris was silent for a long time, his eyes closed as if he were consulting a map etched onto the back of his eyelids. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with risk. There is a place, he said slowly. Before the point was developed, there was an old hydroelectric project here in the 1930s. It was abandoned. They built a massive water intake tunnel, blasted through 2 miles of solid rock. It pulls water from the deepest part of the lake and surfaces half a mile inland, in the middle of the state forest. Can we fit through it? Leo asked, a spark of hope igniting. The tunnel, yes. But it was sealed with a concrete bulkhead 50 years ago, Eris said. But I have a theory. That bulkhead was designed with pressure release gates. After decades of erosion and pressure, it's possible one of those gates has failed. It would be a small opening, the current would be treacherous, and the tunnel itself could be partially collapsed. It's a 1 in 1,000 chance. I'll take those odds over a 1 in a million chance of strolling past Jessica's welcome party on the beach, Leo replied. A new, desperate plan was formed. It was a gamble of the highest order. Eris took a deep, steadying breath and re-engaged the reactor. The low hum returned, a tentative heartbeat in the dark. The damaged submersible, their prison and their only hope, began to stir, preparing to navigate a forgotten, underwater tomb toward an uncertain dawn. The low hum of the reactor was a fragile sound in the immense, crushing silence of the deep. It was the sound of a single, final gamble. With the last of its power, the submersible lifted from the lakebed, its movements slow and deliberate, a wounded creature stirring from a fitful sleep. The intake will be on the northern face of the ridge, Eris said, his voice a low murmur as he stared at the sonar display. He wasn't navigating by sight, but by a 15-year-old memory of an 80-year-old geological survey map. It was carved directly into the cliff wall. It should be there. He guided the vessel toward a massive, dark shape on the sonar. The sub's headlights, flickering with inconsistent power, cut through the murky water and fell upon it. It was the entrance, a perfect, circular maw of concrete, 20 feet in diameter, its edges softened by decades of algae and sediment. The massive steel grate that once covered it had long ago rusted and collapsed, leaving a dark, gaping mouth that seemed to inhale the light. It was the entrance to a forgotten underworld. They paused before it, the small submersible hovering like an insect considering a carnivorous flower. There was no sound, but Leo could feel the immense, silent pull of the current flowing into the tunnel's depths.
It was the point of no return.
Ready? Leo asked. Eris simply nodded, his face set like stone. He eased the throttle forward, and the submersible slipped from the open lake into the suffocating confines of the sunken road. The change was instantaneous and profound. The claustrophobia was a physical presence. The darkness was absolute, broken only by their struggling headlights. The powerful current, just a gentle pull moments before, now seized them in its grip, pulling them deeper into the tunnel at an alarming speed. Eris was no longer just piloting. He was wrestling with a river in a pipe. The pressure differential is stronger than I calculated, he said through gritted teeth, his hands fighting the controls to keep them from being smashed against the rough concrete walls. The first mile was a terrifying, high-speed slalom through the unknown. The tunnel was not a clean, smooth tube. Sections of the concrete lining had crumbled away, exposing the jagged, raw rock behind it. Twisted skeletons of steel rebar jutted out like broken teeth, ready to tear their hull apart. Leo operated the forward sonar and the external lights, his voice a calm, steady stream of instructions in the tense cockpit. Debris at 2 o'clock. Hard to port. Watch the ceiling. It's low here. Suddenly, a massive shape loomed out of the darkness ahead. Brake, Leo yelled. Eris reversed the thrusters, and the sub groaned in protest, slowing just feet from a wall of collapsed rock and concrete. The main passage was almost completely blocked. A small, jagged opening near the floor was the only way through. It looked barely large enough to fit. "I don't know if we'll make it," Eris said, his voice strained. The steady trickle of water from the cracked canopy was a constant reminder of their fragility. "We don't have enough power to go back," Leo stated, his eyes locked on the opening. "And we don't have enough air to wait. We go through." With painstaking slowness, Eris guided the nose of the sub into the opening. The sound of scraping metal and screeching concrete was deafening. The entire vessel shuddered, and alarms blared across the console. A new crack spiderwebbed across the canopy, and the leak of water doubled. But they were inching forward. With a final, violent lurch that threw both men against their harnesses, the sub broke through to the other side. They were deep inside the mountain now, more than a mile in. The air in the cockpit was growing thin and stale, tinged with the metallic scent of overstressed electronics. A yellow warning light for the oxygen scrubbers began to blink. On the surface, Jessica Albright stood at the shoreline, staring out at the placid, moonlit water of the lake. Her teams had reported nothing. No boats, no swimmers, no sign of life. It was as if the submersible and the two men inside had simply vanished from the face of the earth. She was a patient hunter, but the silence was beginning to feel less like a victory and more like a riddle she couldn't solve. Deep beneath her feet, the riddle was turning into a death trap. The lights on the submersible flickered violently, then went out, plunging the cockpit into a terrifying blackness, lit only by the faint, red glow of the emergency alerts. "Main power is failing," Eris cried out, his voice tight with panic. "The reactor is shutting down." The hum of the engines died, and the sub began to drift helplessly in the fast-moving current. Leo frantically tried to reboot the system, but it was no use. The final gamble had failed. Then, the forward sonar, running on the last dregs of battery power, painted one final, horrifying image on the screen before it too went dark. A solid, unmoving wall. The tunnel ahead was completely, utterly blocked. A massive, ancient cave-in. There was no small gap, no way through. It was a dead end. They were trapped, 2 miles deep inside a concrete tomb, in a dead machine, with the water rising inside and the air running out. The silence that followed was heavier and more final than any they had known before. It was the sound of hope dying. The darkness in the cockpit was a physical entity. It was cold, absolute, and filled with the sound of their impending death. The steady trickle of water from the cracked canopy, now a small but determined stream, and the increasingly shallow sound of their own breathing. The water on the floor was past their ankles, icy and black. The submersible was no longer a vessel. It was a coffin, and the current was pushing it gently against its tombstone. "This is it, then," Eris said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He had run the calculations in his head. No power, finite air, a compromised hull, a complete blockage ahead. The variables all added up to 0. After 15 years of hiding from the world, to die in a forgotten tunnel. There's a certain poetry to it, I suppose. A perfectly closed loop. Leo, however, was not the kind of man to appreciate the poetry of a closed loop. His entire life was about finding the loose thread, the hidden latch, the one variable everyone else had missed. He unstrapped himself and retrieved a small, high-intensity flashlight from his go-bag. The narrow, powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rising water and the despair on Eris's face. "I've been in worse spots," Leo said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the scientist's resignation. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Worse than being trapped in a dead machine 2 miles under a mountain with no way out and 3% of breathable air remaining. Eris asked, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "The details are different, but the principle is the same," Leo replied, shining the light around the cramped cockpit, his eyes not just looking, but searching. "You never accept the shape of the box they put you in." He fixed the beam on Eris. "This machine is your masterpiece, a testament to your genius and your paranoia. Don't tell me you didn't build in one last, desperate, insane party trick for a situation exactly like this." Eris was silent for a moment, the question hanging in the stale air. His scientific mind was cataloging reasons for failure, but Leo's words had prodded something else, the part of him that was the paranoid architect, the man who built failsafes for his failsafes. "There is one system," he said slowly, as if retrieving a memory from a deep, dusty archive. "It's not on the main power grid. It runs on a self-contained chemical battery. A last resort. The cockpit severance charges. Leo's eyes narrowed. Severance charges? For small, shaped explosive charges placed at the structural joining of the cockpit to the main reactor and engine section, Eris explained. In the event of a catastrophic reactor breach, the protocol was to sever the connection, turning the cockpit into a crude, unpowered escape pod. I never even tested it. The G-forces would be extreme. An idea, reckless and brilliant, exploded in Leo's mind. Forget the escape pod. Can we redirect the charges? Fire them forward. Forward? Into what? The bulkhead? Eris asked, confused. Not into the bulkhead, Leo said, a grim smile on his face. Through it. That blockage ahead isn't a solid wall of steel. It's a cave-in. Rock, concrete, rebar. It's a pile of rubble. It might be 100 feet thick, or it might just be a thin crust. We don't have the power to drill through it, but maybe we can blast through it. Eris stared at him, horrified. You're insane. The shockwave in this enclosed space could rupture the hull completely. It could bring the rest of the tunnel down on us. We'd be trading a slow death for a fast one. I've always preferred a fast exit, Leo countered. He leaned in, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. Listen to me, Eris. Your brother is on the surface, waiting to erase you. Behind us is a collapsed tunnel. Below us is the hull, and above us is the leak. The only direction we haven't tried is forward. It is either die sitting in this rising water, or die trying to kick the door down. I know which one I'm choosing. For the first time in 15 years, a flicker of the old, defiant Eris Thorn returned to the scientist's eyes. Resignation was replaced by a spark of pure, desperate resolve. The arming panel is behind my seat. What followed was a frantic, clumsy effort in the dark, rising water. They rerouted the detonator cables, a painstaking process in the cramped space. They used the last of the submersible's momentum to wedge its nose firmly against the debris pile. The water was up to their waists now, the air so thin it was getting hard to think. They strapped themselves back into their harnesses, bracing for an impact they couldn't possibly comprehend. Eris had armed the charges. It was up to Leo to pull the trigger. He held the detonator in his hand. A toast, Leo said, his voice tight, to breaking the loop. He slammed the switch. There was no sound, only a silent, violent flash of white light and the sensation of the world being torn apart. The submersible bucked, and the weakened canopy imploded, unleashing the full, crushing force of the water. The last thing Leo felt was the violent, chaotic inrush of the current, a maelstrom of rock, steel, and freezing water, throwing him into a black, churning void. He didn't know if they had broken through, or if they had just blown the door off their own tomb. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, brutal shock. One moment there was the silent flash of the explosion. The next, there was only the chaos of a cold, black, churning void. Leo's lungs burned for air, his ears rang from the blast, and his entire body ached from the shockwave. He was being tumbled end over end by a current of unimaginable force, surrounded by the sharp, unseen teeth of rock and twisted metal. His survival instincts, honed by a life of calculated risks, screamed at him. There was no up or down, only the relentless, forward crush of the water. He fought the panic, forced his limbs to move, and kicked toward what he hoped was the surface. His head broke through into a pocket of stale, trapped air, and he took a ragged, desperate gasp. He was still in the tunnel. The explosion had ripped their world apart, but the tunnel itself had held. He fumbled at his belt, his numb fingers searching for his go bag. It was still there, battered but intact. He found the small, waterproof flashlight and thumbed the switch. The beam flickered to life, a pathetic, fragile spear of light against an infinite, roaring darkness. He swept the beam across the water, his heart pounding. The current was a river now, flowing fast through the newly opened passage. The wreckage of the submersible was gone, torn to pieces and swallowed by the torrent. "Eris," he shouted, his voice hoarse and immediately snatched away by the roar of the water. He swept the beam back and forth, a frantic search in the churning debris. He saw a flash of pale skin, a hand. "Eris." The scientist was pinned against a collapsed section of concrete, a heavy piece of the sub's hull pressing his leg against the wall. His head was slumped forward, and he was dangerously close to being fully submerged. Adrenaline surged through Leo, overriding the pain. He fought his way against the powerful current, the water trying to tear him away. Every foot was a battle. He finally reached Eris and put his fingers to the man's neck. A faint, thready pulse. He was alive. "Eris, wake up." Leo yelled, shaking him. The scientist's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. "My leg," Eris gasped. "It's trapped." Leo aimed the flashlight down. Eris's leg was wedged at an ugly angle beneath a jagged piece of the cockpit's frame. There was no way to lift it against the force of the water. He needed leverage. He pulled a small, titanium pry bar from his bag. Treading water with his legs and bracing himself against the wall with one arm, he wedged the bar into the gap and pushed with every ounce of strength he had. The metal groaned in protest. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, grating screech, the wreckage shifted just enough. Leo pulled Eris free. The scientist cried out in pain, his leg clearly broken. He was a dead weight now, barely conscious. The mission to save the world from Project Chimera had devolved into a primal, desperate struggle to save one man from drowning in a forgotten tunnel. With Eris's arms slung over his shoulder, Leo let the current take them. There was no more fighting it. The River of Ghosts was their only way out. What followed was an eternity of cold and pain. They were dragged through the darkness, scraping against the rough walls, bumping off unseen debris. Leo's only job was to keep Eris's head above water and try to use his own body as a shield. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them back into absolute blackness. He lost all track of time. It could have been minutes or hours. His strength was gone, his limbs were numb with cold, and his lungs burned with every breath. He was on the verge of letting go, of succumbing to the cold, quiet promise of the dark water. And then he saw it. It wasn't a light. It was the absence of perfect blackness. A faint, milky, greenish glow, far ahead in the direction they were being pulled. It was dim, ethereal, but it was unmistakably real. Moonlight, filtering down from above. It was the end of the tunnel. It was the drainage grate. Hope, fierce and unexpected, shot through him, a final, potent surge of adrenaline. He tightened his grip on Eris. "We're almost there," he rasped, though he didn't know if the scientist could hear him. "Almost there. Just hold on." The faint glow grew brighter, outlining the shape of the tunnel ahead. He could hear a new sound, too, beneath the roar of the water. The distant, gentle whisper of wind through trees. It was the sound of the living world. Salvation was just ahead, but it felt 1,000 miles away, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had nothing left to give. Hope is a brutal motivator. The faint, ghostly light ahead was just enough to reignite the dwindling embers of Leo's will to survive. It gave his burning muscles a reason to keep fighting, his aching lungs a reason to keep gasping for air. With the dead weight of Eris Thorn slung over his shoulder, he kicked and clawed his way through the last stretch of the underwater tomb. The roar of the water grew louder as they neared the end, the current funneling toward the exit with terrifying force. The pale light grew brighter, resolving itself into a distinct pattern, a grid of thick, iron bars, choked with a century's worth of rust and debris. The drainage grate. It was their gate to freedom, and it was their final obstacle. They hit it without warning. The force of the water slammed them against the iron bars with a bone-jarring impact. The pressure was immense, pinning them to the grate like insects on a screen. The water rushed past them and through the gaps, a violent, roaring torrent that threatened to tear them apart. Leo gasped, the impact having forced the last of the air from his lungs. Eris was a dead weight, his semi-conscious form limp against the bars. Leo knew they had seconds. The grate was ancient, thick as his wrist in places, fused together by time and corrosion. There was no breaking it. Frantically, his free hand scrabbled across the bars, searching for a weak point. He felt for a lock, a hinge, a section that had rusted through. His fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, found it a lower quadrant where the vertical and horizontal bars had once been joined. The connecting bolt had long since disintegrated, and the bars were held together by nothing more than rust and the pressure of the water itself. He had no leverage. He had no tools left. He had only his own failing strength. Bracing his feet against the concrete wall of the tunnel, he hooked his fingers around the loose bars and pulled. He roared, the sound lost in the thunder of the water, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Nothing. He pulled again, a final, desperate surge of pure adrenaline. There was a hideous, grating screech of metal on metal. The rusted section bent, then broke free, creating a jagged, narrow opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through. He didn't hesitate. He shoved Eris through the gap first, the scientist's limp body spilling out into the pool beyond. Then, Leo followed, the sharp, rusted edges of the iron tearing at his clothes and skin as he forced his way through. He emerged into a deep, stone-lined culvert, the water churning around him before flowing out into the forest. He had done it. They were out. For a long moment, Leo did nothing but lie half in and half out of the water, his face turned to the night sky. He greedily gulped down the cold, clean air, scented with pine and damp earth. Above, the moon was a sliver of silver light, veiled by the canopy of the trees. The roar of the tunnel was replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being alive was so powerful it was dizzying. But the moment of peace was fleeting. A violent shiver racked his body, a reminder of the hypothermia setting in. He looked over at Eris, who lay pale and still on the mossy stones. The scientist's breathing was shallow, and his face was a ghostly white in the moonlight. The struggle was not over. It had just changed its form. The raw, physical battle against the tunnel was finished. Now began the quiet, desperate battle against the elements and time. With his last reserves of strength, Leo dragged Eris from the churning water of the culvert and into the dense cover of a thicket of ferns. Eris groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. His pant leg was soaked in blood, the crude angle of his broken leg even more apparent now that he was on solid ground. They were exposed. They were injured. And they were still being hunted. Leo tore strips from his already ruined shirt and, using a fallen branch, fashioned a crude but effective splint for Eris's leg. The scientist cried out once, a sharp intake of breath, then fell into a shivering state of semi-consciousness. Leo crouched beside him, taking stock. They had survived the impossible, but they were in the middle of a vast state forest, miles from any town. Eris couldn't walk, and Leo was in no condition to carry him far. They needed shelter, fire, and medical attention, all things that would make them visible vulnerable. He finished securing the splint and was about to try and find a more sheltered spot, a rock overhang or a hollow log when he froze. He tilted his head, listening. It was a sound that did not belong in the deep woods, a sound that chilled his blood far more than the lake water had. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic, pulsing thump-thump-thump of a helicopter. It was searching, its sound waves cutting through the tranquil sounds of the forest night. Jessica was not confining her search to the water. She was expanding her net. They had escaped the cage only to find themselves in the center of a vast, open hunting ground. Leo looked from the helpless form of Eris Thorn to the dark, uncaring sky and knew that the night was far from over. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the helicopter's rotors was the sound of the world's most persistent predator. It grew from a distant pulse to a deafening roar, a physical presence that vibrated through the ground and into Leo's bones. Panic was a useless luxury. Action was the only currency that mattered. "Don't make a sound," he whispered to the semi-conscious Eris, though he knew the man was in no condition to do so. With a surge of adrenaline that ignored his own screaming muscles, Leo dragged Eris deeper into the forest, away from the relative openness of the culvert. He found what he was looking for, a dense, ancient thicket of rhododendron, its thick, waxy leaves forming a nearly impenetrable canopy. The ground beneath was damp and cold, thick with a carpet of decaying leaves. He pulled Eris into the heart of the thicket, then covered them both with loose branches and wet handfuls of leaf litter. He knew that thermal imaging was their greatest enemy, and their only defense was the cold, wet earth, and the thickest cover he could find. They lay motionless, buried in the dark, as the helicopter passed almost directly overhead. A brilliant, terrifyingly bright searchlight cut through the forest, its beams slicing through the trees just yards from their hiding spot. The downdraft from the rotors tore at their makeshift cover, and for a heart-stopping moment, Leo was sure they would be exposed. He held his breath, every muscle tensed, a fox in its hole as the hunter circled above. The light swept past. The sound began to recede. The helicopter was moving on, its search pattern taking it further south along the forest line. They were safe for now. The reprieve was fleeting. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind only the deep, aching cold, and profound exhaustion. Leo carefully uncovered them. Eris was shivering violently, his skin clammy to the touch. The makeshift splint on his leg was soaked with blood. "We can't stay here," Leo said, more to himself than to Eris. "When the sun comes up, they'll start a ground search. We need to move. We need shelter." He looked at Eris, a brilliant mind trapped in a broken body. There was no way the scientist could walk. Leo's eyes scanned the surrounding woods, his mind shifting from evader to builder. He drew the small, sturdy knife from his go bag. He found 2 long, straight saplings and cut them down. Using the tattered remains of his own jacket and the rope from his bag, he began lashing cross pieces into place, fashioning a crude but strong travois, a drag sled designed to be pulled by a single person. As he worked, his hands clumsy with cold, Eris's eyes opened. They were clear, lucid, the scientist's powerful intellect burning through the fog of pain and shock. He watched Leo for a moment. "Your strategy is sound," Eris rasped, his voice weak. "But it is incomplete. You have no destination." "Anywhere, but here's a good start," Leo replied grimly, cinching a knot tight. "No," Eris insisted. "Random movement is a death sentence. We need a defensible position, a location they won't have on any modern map." He coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. "Before, when I was building my sanctuary, I studied every survey of this region, going back 100 years. There is a place, a fire tower, on the summit of Black Ridge, about 5 miles northeast of here." Leo stopped working and looked at him. "A fire tower?" "It was part of the old Civilian Conservation Corps. Decommissioned in the 1970s, Eris explained, his words slow but precise. "It's a steel structure on a stone foundation. It will be shelter. More importantly, it provides a 360-degree view of the surrounding terrain. We can see them coming long before they see us. It's our only logical move. A destination. A sliver of strategic hope in a sea of tactical desperation." Eris, even broken and bleeding, was still a formidable asset. Leo finished the travois. The task of moving Eris onto it was a slow, agonizing process for both men. He carefully patted the rough branches with ferns and leaves, then gently eased the scientist onto the sled, taking care not to jostle his broken leg. He fashioned a harness from the last of his rope and looped it over his shoulders. He stood, feeling the full, dead weight of his companion. 5 miles, through dense, unfamiliar forest, in the dark, while injured and exhausted. It seemed an impossible task, but it was the only task that mattered. With a deep breath that scraped his raw lungs, Leo leaned into the harness and took the first, difficult step. The travois scraped over the leaves and roots behind him. He set his eyes on the North Star, a faint point of light in the sky, and began the long, slow journey northeast. One man, a survivor, dragging another, a scientist, away from the ruins of their escape and toward the ghost of a sanctuary on a distant ridge. The long road of night had just begun. The forest had no paths. Every foot of progress was a battle won against a landscape that seemed actively hostile to their survival. Leo leaned into the harness, the rough material digging into his raw shoulders. The travois, a clumsy raft of sticks and hope, snagged on every exposed root and scraped over every rock, sending jolts of pain through Eris and threatening to tear itself apart. The 5 miles Eris had spoken of were not a straight line on a map. They were a vertical, grueling ascent through dense undergrowth, across ice-cold streams, and up muddy, leaf-slicked inclines. The world shrank to the small, bobbing circle of a dying flashlight and the rhythmic, agonizing pull and slide of the sled. It was a journey measured in inches, paid for in sweat and blood. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting position of the moon through the thick canopy. During a brief, desperate pause for rest, Leo collapsed against a tree, his lungs heaving, his body a single, unified chorus of pain. Eris, pale and shivering on the travois, watched him, his sharp, analytical eyes cutting through his own haze of suffering. "Why?" Eris asked, his voice a dry rasp. Leo, trying to slow his breathing, looked over at him. "Why what? Why this?" Eris clarified, gesturing weakly with his head to their whole, miserable situation. "Your mission was complete. You had the data from the drive. You exposed my brother's financial empire. I saw the news alerts before the power went out. You could have vanished. Why come for me? Why risk your life, dragging a broken man through a forest, hunted by an army. It was the question of a scientist, a man who needed the variables to add up to a logical conclusion. Leo was a variable that made no sense. Leo was silent for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the forest night. "When I was young," he began, his voice low, "I learned that most of the world runs on ledgers, debits and credits. People see a system that's imbalanced, and they try to fix it by moving a few numbers from one column to another. They protest, they vote, they write letters. They try to nudge the system back into balance." He shifted his weight, the movement a painful effort. "I don't nudge," he said. "I learned that some systems, some people, get so powerful and corrupt that their ledgers are meaningless. They operate outside the rules. The only way to balance a ledger like that is to burn the book and start over. I'm the man who burns the book." "You're an agent of chaos," Eris stated, his voice lacking judgment. It was an observation. "I'm an agent of balance," Leo corrected. "Chaos is just the tool I use to achieve it. Your brother's financial crimes, that was just a column in his ledger. Dirty, but predictable. Project Chimera." Leo shook his head, looking away into the darkness. "That wasn't in the ledger. That was something else entirely. It was a plan to burn the whole library, to fundamentally rewrite the rules of life and death for power and profit. That goes beyond mischief, Eris. Some things you can't just walk away from. Some things have to be answered." The confession hung in the cold air between them. It was the closest Leo had ever come to defining his own strange, chaotic moral code. Eris was silent, but a new understanding dawned in his eyes. He wasn't just a piece of evidence to Leo. He was a part of the answer. Meanwhile, in a hastily erected command post on the shore of the lake, the first gray light of dawn was approaching. Jessica Albright stood before a massive topographical map of the state forest, her face illuminated by the glow. "Sun up in 30 minutes, she announced to her team leaders. The helicopter sweeps found nothing overnight. That means they're either still in the water, or they made it to shore and they're hiding. They're on foot, and confirmed reports from the compound suggest one of them, Thorn, may be injured. They won't be moving fast." She began drawing grids on the map with a red marker. "We'll start with a 5-mile radius from their likely point of egress. I want ground teams sweeping these sectors. They're cold, they're tired, and they're bleeding. They will make a mistake. Find it." Deep in the woods, the world was shifting from black to a deep, bruised purple. Exhaustion was a physical weight on Leo's eyelids. He felt like he could sleep for a year, but he knew that to stop now meant death. He forced himself to his feet, his joints screaming, and took up the harness once more. He had been pulling for what felt like an eternity when Eris spoke again, his voice tight with a new urgency. "Leo, stop." Leo paused, turning to see Eris pointing a trembling finger upwards toward the northeast. "There." Leo followed his gaze. Through a break in the trees, high above them on the summit of the ridge they had been climbing, a structure was just visible, silhouetted against the rapidly lightening sky. It was a skeletal framework of rusted steel, thin and ghostly in the pre-dawn light. The fire tower. It was real. It was there. But the sun was rising behind it, casting long, accusing shadows through the forest. Their destination was in sight, but so was the dawn. And with the dawn came the hunters. The hardest part of the climb was still ahead of them, and their race against the sun had just begun. The fire tower was a promise and a threat. Its skeletal frame, silhouetted against the rapidly brightening dawn, was the first real sign of hope they'd had in what felt like a lifetime. But the same sun that illuminated their goal also exposed them, painting them as clear, moving targets against the landscape. The shadows were shrinking. Their time was running out. The final ascent to the ridge was the cruelest part of the journey. The ground became a steep, unforgiving incline of loose shale and tangled roots. Every upward step was a struggle against gravity and his own screaming exhaustion. The travois, which had been a burden on flat ground, now felt like an anchor, threatening to drag both him and Eris back down into the woods with every slip of his foot. His vision narrowed to a gray, swimming tunnel. All that existed was the burn in his legs, the raw pain in his shoulders, and the next place to plant his foot. He was running on nothing but the fumes of his own willpower. He was halfway up a rocky scramble when Eris let out a sharp, guttural hiss. "Leo, stop. Now." The urgency in the scientist's voice cut through Leo's haze of pain. He froze instantly, pressing himself and the travois flat against a granite rock face. He followed Eris's terrified gaze downwards. Through a gap in the foliage below, he saw them. A four-man team, dressed in the same tactical gear as the men who had stormed the compound, was moving methodically along the base of the ridge. They were less than 200 yards away. Leo could hear the faint crackle of their radios, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the morning stillness. One of them paused, lifting a pair of binoculars to scan the ridge line. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He was sure the man was looking right at them. They were utterly exposed. He pressed himself harder against the cold stone, willing them both to become invisible. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the man lowered his binoculars and the team moved on, disappearing back into the dense woods. They had not been seen. The close call shattered any remaining vestiges of Leo's exhaustion. He was flooded with a new, frantic energy. It wasn't a second wind. It was a desperate, panicked sprint. He scrambled up the rest of the incline, no longer caring about the noise, his only thought to reach the summit, to reach the tower. He burst through the final line of trees and collapsed, gasping, onto the small, flat clearing at the top of the ridge. There it was, the fire tower. It was a rusted, forlorn ghost of a structure, its steel latticework groaning softly in the morning breeze. At its base was a small, windowless room built of heavy stone, and from its center, a rickety steel staircase spiraled up 100 feet to a tiny, glass-walled cabin at the top. The door to the stone room was secured with a heavy, ancient padlock, its surface a solid mass of orange rust. For a moment, Leo felt a surge of despair. To have come all this way, only to be stopped by a simple lock. But he was a master of locks. It was his first and oldest art. With hands that trembled uncontrollably from cold and fatigue, he pulled out his picks. The rust fought him. The mechanism was stiff with disuse, but the internal logic of the tumblers was a language he understood better than any other. After a few tense, agonizing minutes, the lock clicked open. He half-carried, half-dragged Eris inside, laying him gently on the dusty concrete floor. They were out of sight. They were sheltered from the wind. It was the first moment of true safety they had known since the raid on the loft. Eris, his face ashen, looked up at Leo. "We made it," the scientist whispered in disbelief. "We're not safe yet," Leo countered, his breath still ragged. "We're cornered. I need to see what we're up against." He left Eris in the relative safety of the stone room and began the ascent up the tower stairs. The structure swayed with every step, the rusted metal groaning in protest. He climbed higher and higher, the trees falling away below him, until he finally pulled himself up through a hatch into the small observation cabin at the top. The view stole what little breath he had left. The world was spread out before him. He could see the entire forest, a vast carpet of green and gold rolling out for miles in every direction. In the distance, Cayuga Lake was a sheet of polished blue steel under the morning sun. But it wasn't the beauty that held him transfixed. It was the hunt. From his godlike vantage point, he could see Jessica Albright's operation in its entirety. He saw one of her teams moving along the eastern slope. He saw another sweeping the valley to the west. He saw a third team, the one that had passed them, beginning a new grid search at the base of their ridge. They were all moving with methodical precision, their paths destined to converge on this very spot. They had reached their sanctuary, their high ground. But it was not a fortress. It was an island, and the tide of hunters was rising on all sides. Leo descended the rickety tower stairs, the breathtaking view from the top having been replaced by a cold, tactical map of their impending doom in his mind. He entered the dim, dusty stone room at the base, where Eris was propped against a wall, his face pale and tight with pain. "The good news is, we have the high ground," Leo said, his voice devoid of any real optimism. "The bad news is, we're on an island. I counted 3 teams, at least a dozen men, maybe more. They're in a classic grid search pattern. They'll be at the base of this ridge within 2 hours, maybe less." He expected to see despair in the scientist's eyes. He expected the man's fragile composure to finally shatter. Instead, Eris's gaze sharpened, his brilliant mind moving past the immediate terror and onto the variables of the problem. "Then a direct defense is impossible," Eris stated, his voice a low rasp. "Their training, their equipment, their numbers. We cannot win a direct confrontation." "I had come to the same conclusion," Leo said grimly. "Therefore," Eris continued, his eyes scanning the forgotten contents of the small room, "we must change the nature of the confrontation. We cannot fight them, but perhaps we can confuse them." His gaze fell upon a corner of the room, on a pile of junk left behind decades ago. A small, rust-eaten gasoline generator. A corroded metal box that once held emergency supplies. A can of what looked like ancient, dried-out paint. To Leo, it was garbage. To Eris, it was a chemistry set. The generator, Eris said, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. It won't run, but the battery inside, it will be a lead-acid battery. And that box, those will be old road flares. They contain potassium perchlorate, a powerful oxidizer. He gestured to the can. And that paint, if it's old enough, it will be oil-based. A fuel. Leo stared at him, not understanding. You're going to build a bomb? No, Eris corrected, a faint, almost manic smile touching his lips. Bombs are for soldiers. We are not soldiers. We are ghosts. I'm going to give you the tools to create a haunting. For the next hour, the stone room became a frantic, makeshift laboratory. Eris, the immobile architect, gave a stream of clipped, precise instructions. Leo, his hands and feet, worked with a desperate urgency. He drained the sulfuric acid from the old battery into a glass bottle he found. He carefully crushed the chemical pellets from the road flares, separating the components as Eris directed. He mixed the volatile ingredients, creating a series of small, unstable chemical packages. These are not explosives, Eris explained as Leo worked. They are rapid chemical reaction devices. When triggered, they will produce a loud concussive bang and a thick cloud of acrid, disorienting smoke. They are loud, they are frightening, and they are non-lethal. They are noise and confusion. They are the whispers of our ghosts. While Eris designed the diversions, Leo planned the stage for his illusion. He used the last of his rope and some old wiring he stripped from the generator to create a series of tripwires. He ventured out from the tower in short, frantic trips, moving with a woodsman's stealth. He laid a clear, obvious false trail leading down the steep, treacherous western slope of the ridge, a path no sane person would take. Along this path, he set his traps. One tripwire was rigged to topple a pile of loose, rusted metal sheets he found, creating a horrific clatter. Further down, he placed Eris's chemical packages, each one a carefully prepared surprise for their pursuers. His final act of preparation was the most important. He took the hardened drive containing Project Chimera, wrapped it in the last waterproof pouch from his bag, and attached it to Eris, securing it beneath his clothes. If we get separated, Leo said, his voice low and serious, this is all that matters. You protect this, no matter what. Eris simply nodded, understanding the grim finality of the instruction. Leo had just returned to the tower, his heart hammering from the exertion and the fear, when he heard it. The snap of a twig on the trail below. A man's voice, low and professional. Ridge summit, 200 meters. They were here. Leo scrambled inside the stone room, barring the heavy wooden door. He and Eris exchanged a single look in the dim light. Their blueprint for ghosts was complete. The actors were taking the stage. They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the approaching hunters, waiting for the first act of their desperate play to begin. Outside, a man in tactical gear, moving carefully up the main trail, snagged his boot on a thin, almost invisible wire. There was a sharp crack that echoed through the forest like a rifle shot, followed instantly by a thick, billowing cloud of greasy, black smoke that erupted from the trees 20 yards to his left. Confused shouts immediately filled the air. Contact. Left flank. Unknown device. The haunting had begun. The first crack of the chemical noisemaker was a starting pistol for the final act of Leo's grand illusion. In the stone room, Eris flinched, but Leo simply smiled, a grim, tired expression. He could hear the confused shouts of the tactical team filtering up the ridge, their professional composure momentarily fractured by the unexpected. They were trained for firefights and ambushes, not for what amounted to a theatrical special effect. They've taken the bait, Leo whispered. From a command post miles away, Jessica Albright watched the helmet cam footage from her team leader. She saw the billowing, unnatural smoke and heard the confusion in her men's voices. Her eyes narrowed. It felt wrong. Too chaotic, too theatrical. It's a diversion, she said into her command line. He's trying to pull Team Alpha off the main trail. Team Bravo, continue your ascent from the south. All teams, be advised, expect misdirection. Our target is a trickster, not a soldier. But even as she gave the order, a second, louder bang erupted from the far side of the ridge, followed by a flash of brilliant magnesium white light. Team Bravo, ascending the southern slope, immediately hit the dirt. Contact south slope. Possible explosive device. On her tactical map, Jessica saw her two lead teams now fixated on opposite sides of the ridge, their attention drawn away from the direct path to the tower. Leo hadn't just created one ghost. He had created a chorus, turning the entire summit into a disorienting hall of mirrors. He was hurting them. This isn't just a diversion, she realized aloud. It's a performance. Inside the tower's base, Leo knew the clock was ticking. The confusion wouldn't last forever. It's time, he said to Eris. He looked at the rickety spiral staircase that led to the top. Can you climb? Eris looked at his splinted leg, then back at Leo, a look of pure, agonized determination in his eyes. You get me upright. I'll do the rest. What followed was the most painful journey yet. Leo supported Eris's weight as the scientist, using the central pillar of the staircase for balance, began to haul himself upwards, step by agonizing step. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, but he never cried out, his focus absolute. As they climbed, Jessica's teams were cautiously advancing, sweeping the woods for a phantom that was never there. They found the remnants of the chemical devices and the tripwires, realizing they'd been duped. The team leaders conferred, their voices tense with frustration. All signs, all trails, real and false, ultimately pointed to one place, the tower. They began to converge on the stone building at its base. Leo and Eris finally reached the top, emerging into the cold, windswept air of the observation cabin. Eris collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Leo immediately went to the far side of the cabin, his eyes searching. And he found it. It was an old emergency fire escape, a relic from a bygone era of safety protocols. It consisted of a heavy steel cable, anchored to the cabin's frame, that ran all the way down the steepest, western face of the ridge, disappearing into a line of ancient pine trees 1,000 feet below. A rusted metal basket, big enough for one person, was still attached to the cable by a pulley mechanism. It was a primitive zip line, and it looked like it hadn't been used in 50 years. Down below, the first tactical team arrived at the base of the tower. We're at the primary structure, the leader reported. Door is barred from the inside, preparing to breach. Leo worked with a frantic speed, checking the rusted pulley, testing the strength of the anchor point. It was a terrible risk, but it was their only one. He helped Eris into the cramped metal basket. He then attached himself to the outside of it with the last of his rope, his body acting as a crude rudder and brake. This is going to hurt, Leo said. My dear boy, Eris replied, his eyes closed. Everything already does. Just as the sound of a battering ram echoed from the stone room below, Leo pulled the release lever. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of tortured, rusted metal, the pulley caught, and they were launched into the open air. They plunged down the mountainside, the wind screaming past them, the forest floor a dizzying green blur below. The ancient cable held. Jessica Albright's team leader kicked open the door to the stone room. It was empty. A few empty bottles, some scattered chemical powders, and a hastily discarded jacket were the only signs that anyone had been there. The stage was empty. The actors had vanished. The team leader looked up through the open ceiling at the spiraling staircase. They're in the tower, he yelled. He and his men stormed up the stairs, weapons raised, expecting a final confrontation in the cabin above. They found it just as empty. But through the grimy glass of the western window, the team leader saw it. The emergency cable, still vibrating from its sudden, heavy use. He looked down the sheer face of the mountain and understood. Leo and Eris hit the end of the line with a brutal, crashing impact, landing in a deep thicket of pine that cushioned their fall. They were battered, bruised, and broken, but they were at the bottom of the ridge, a mile away from the search teams, hidden in a part of the forest no one would think to look. They were free. Days later, in a small, quiet motel room hundreds of miles away, a television played on mute. The news was full of the spectacular downfall of Marcus Thorne, his empire in ruins, his reputation destroyed by the financial data Leo had leaked. He was a king dethroned, not by an army, but by a single, well-placed whisper. Eris, his leg properly set and casted, was propped up in a chair, the small, hardened drive containing the secrets of Project Chimera on the table beside him. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a purpose, carefully planning how to release the truth to the world, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Leo stood by the window, his go bag at his feet. His work here was done. The scales were, for the moment, balanced. He had started a fire, and now it was up to the rest of the world to deal with the light. He gave a small nod to Eris, a silent acknowledgement of their impossible journey. Then, like the phantom he was, he opened the door and slipped away, disappearing back into the world, a trickster forever searching for the next book that needed to be burned.